can you let everybody know who you are and what it is that you do?
Sure. Well, Adam Vaughan, I'm currently a member of Parliament and represent the neighborhoods around Alex Park and, of course, Alex Park. And before that, I was a city councillor who also represented this area and been working with residents and neighbors and the community centre to realize Sonny Atkinson's vision of what this community can be. I first really came and started and spent time in the community, sort of walking through it and understanding it with Sonny. A long time ago when I was a reporter, and his vision for self-realization, self-determination had always stuck with me. And when I ran for city council, it was great to be able to join the community and help them on the journey towards that better tomorrow that so many of the old-time residents here have had as a dream for a long time.
Amazing. You kind of touched on it a bit, but a few of my colleagues have never officially met you, but they say they remember you as a kid riding around the neighborhood, admiring the different architecture and the structures in the building. They feel like you stood out to them because you were this unknown white man who didn't really have an address in the neighborhood, but you didn't look like the stereotypical police officer or drug addicts that frequent the area. You just seemed chill. What is it that attracted you to the community?
Well, I knew I went to high school with Randy Padmore, right? So I knew some of the folks that lived here, and it was never sort of a, even back then though, it was walled off then, a lot of the tall walls and stuff that Sonny literally knocked down. But it was just a neat neighborhood to ride a bike. I've never really owned a car, so I used to go to Kensington Market, live down on Queen Street, and I'd sort of wander through, and it just had a nice neighborhood feel to it, and walking through and saying hello to folks and starting conversations. At first, I think they thought I was a cop, but it was just a nice place to come through and watch the kids play in the courtyards and stuff. And the more time you spent here, the more interesting it was. So I spent time here, sort of not as a tourist. It was a shortcut through to get from where I was going. But it was the more you cut through it, the more times you sort of would see people and say hello. And years later, when I came to represent the place, I never got lost here because I knew how to get through the neighborhood, which is part of the mystery in the old neighborhood. But it just became a place that was part of the city I lived in, and a quick way to ride a bike from Queen Street through to Kensington Market.
Amazing. What neighborhood did you grow up in?
I grew up Bathurst and St. Clair. I grew up at a place called Witchwood Park, but that's where I spent most of my youth. And then when I was young, when I left high school early, I had a friend who lived down at Queen of Bathurst, and we lived in an apartment there for a bit. And I've just always lived along Queen Street, and so the market has been where I shopped, and Alex Park was just sort of one of the things you cut through on your way to going to market.
Yeah, I've often found over the years Alexandra Park just seems to be like that thoroughfare part of the city.
You have to know it though, right?
Yes, you definitely do.
And it was even harder back then, because back then they literally had walls around it. It was like they were keeping the city away and keeping the folks in Alex Park sort of behind walls, which was kind of weird. But and I met the architect who built the neighborhood, who argued endlessly with at then Metro Housing not to put walls around the community, to sort of let the neighborhood and let the city touch and flow through together. And I came through the neighborhood with them, and he was so happy that the residents had taken the sledgehammer to the walls, knocked them down, and made the neighborhood more of a place to visit and less of a place to sort of stay away from.
Got you. As I'm sure you know, there are various relationships people in the community have with their parents, more particularly between father and son. In some instances, you have the prototypical relationships where the father is your inspiration and your hero. In others, they're villains, toxic, or just non-existent. Your father, Colin Vaughan, was a Canadian rock star and an icon in some eyes. And some would say you have a strong likeness to him. Would you care to discuss your father's roots and lineage from Australia to Canada, and also who he was, what he did, and whether it has any significance to you or your personal mission?
Yeah,
It's kind of a long question, but
that's right. That's right. It's not a question I get asked a lot in reference to Alex Park, but so my dad's from Australia, and when he first came to Toronto, my mom was also from Australia. She was playing tennis, and there was a cricket match on, and he was sitting by the edge of the match, and they heard he was Australian and asked him to play. And he started to play in the Premier League in Toronto back in the '60s, and the West Indies cricket team was on the ascent right then, and the Wiffle Club, the old West Indian Federation club that used to be at college and just near college in Bathurst, used to be a place where he hung out on a Saturday afternoon after a match. And I think the fact that we were immigrants and we didn't go up to cottages in the summertime, we stayed in the city. My dad was an architect and did a number of started City Home, which was when he was on city council was a public housing corporation that the city of Toronto started before TCHC and all of that. And he was fascinated by the way in which neighborhoods worked. And the table talk when I was a kid was about why this neighborhood was strong, why it was weak, why it needed to be protected. He fought to keep the expressway out of the downtown core, which had a huge impact on preserving Alex Park. But he also did work in the States. And I remember a political speech he gave just before the second election. The night before the second election, he talked about being in Baltimore. And they required a gang member to take him around the public housing neighborhoods in Baltimore. And when he left the hotel that night, he wanted to go back to a place he'd seen on the walk. And the doorman grabbed him and said, "You can't go there." And he talked about the need to build neighborhoods that are functional, that are safe, that are real, but more importantly, that didn't lock in trouble, that instead gave rise to opportunities to people and housed people that were successful, that came out of the community and kept the community strong. And a lot of what he talked about in terms of what made a great neighborhood, you see in Alex Park day in and day out, minute by minute, family by family. And my father's, I think, approach to city building, but more importantly, approach to people and his friendships that he made on the cricket pitch, I think opened up that part of Toronto to him back in the '60s, which I don't think was typical for a lot of folks that were professional and white and middle class. But it gave me an understanding that boundaries weren't there to be feared or stayed away from. That we shared a city, we shared cultures, we shared experiences in the city in the summer, we shared a high school, we shared friends, and I think that raised me to feel comfortable in communities where normally middle class white kids didn't wander. It was, to me, it was just, these are my dad's friends, right? These are the sort of folks that I see when I'm hanging around the cricket pitch on a Saturday afternoon, and it led me to high school and folks like Courtney Betty and the Jones brothers, the Mark and Paul, and of course Randy, but there was Norm Clark. It was a long list. We grew up together, and because we were all in the city in the summertime, we'd be at the parks together and stuff. And so it's a way of living in the city that my father and my mom showed me, that I think probably set me up for the conversations, the friendships, and the relationships that have evolved out of Alex Park. It was just part of what we did, and I think my eyes were open to the realities of this neighborhood differently because of it.
Absolutely. Um, so you kind of touched on it a bit. In the '60s, Colin, being known as the thoughtful architect that he was, and who was possibly at the time considering becoming a city councilor, turned out to be one with the Stop Spadina movement. Can you explain a little bit about what that movement was and how it affected or could have affected the city, in particular Alexandra Park?
There were a number of things at play in the '60s, and this neighborhood is a product of that kind of mindset where old neighborhoods were being flattened and projects were being built, big roads, big housing projects, big transit projects. it was incredibly destructive. It's weird. If this neighborhood had been left to evolve by itself, many of the families that are tenants here would have been homeowners now, and that would have transformed their sense of security and sense of place in the city, and the community would have looked much like Kensington Market does. And it was lost. It was lost to this kind of vision that the government knew best, that communities didn't have control over their own future, and that big projects could displace people and break things, things that you'd never get back because of the fragility of the way communities sort of organically are created in urban spaces, especially older parts of Toronto. My dad had a bit of a conversion on the road. I mean, he used to build tall buildings and race cars and do all the things like a typical sort of 50s, 60s architect would do. But he met someone called Jane Jacobs. She challenged him to think differently. Her books certainly changed his way of thinking about cities. And he started to lead campaigns to push the big developers away, to push the big projects away, and to really hold on to what was precious in the city, which is unique in the city, which is the neighborhoods that had organically grown out of the earliest architecture in Toronto. And so, as he really stopped doing that kind of architecture that was just simply building buildings and started to think more about building cities. He led the citizens movement that stopped the expressway, that changed the course of history for the downtown. It was too late to save this neighborhood, but I think that this neighborhood is surrounded by these old neighborhoods around Toronto, are close to Chinatown, close to Kensington Market. The neighborhood schools are still, neighborhood schools that kids walk to and don't take buses to. All these sorts of things were products of the thinking that my father, embraced and absorbed. And when he was on a city council, he moved to do things like the first co-op around the corner, the Alexandra Park co-op, not the Alex Park co-op, the Sunny Atkinson co-op. Things like that, the Scatting Court. They really worked hard at building stronger and stronger community institutions and empowering neighborhoods to dream their own future and not have to have city council come along and bulldoze everything, but instead to champion the lived experience of people in these communities and to build neighborhoods around them, but build neighborhoods with them and for them. And it was a good practice, and I think it led to a lot of the great things we love about Toronto still being part of what we describe when we talk about Toronto to people who are visiting for the first time or never seen the city. Strong neighborhoods, good community centers, adjacency to schools, parks, human scale, safe streets to walk on, and traffic that is not overwhelming the senses or putting kids at risk, and all these sorts of things. And you can see it in Alex Park. Right? It's still a neighborhood. It still sees itself as a neighborhood. It behaves as a neighborhood, and it's dreamt a new future for itself as a neighborhood. And those qualities come out of that school of thinking that cities are magic places. You have to be careful with them because they house people and people with dreams. And even though they'll change and they evolve, if they evolve as a human project as opposed to an engineering project, you get better results. And this community to this day has thrived under those sorts of conditions.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Being a former resident of the community and living in different parts of the city, it's very, very hard to find something similar to the vibe that's just down and around here. And that pretty much nails why.
People know each other. Like
Exactly.
that's not as common downtown as it. I mean, we take it for granted in neighborhoods where that's true still. But it's rare. Like when you knock doors in this neighborhood, or when you hang out in this neighborhood for any period of time, you see the families taking care of each other's kids. You see young people taking groceries for older folks. You see a real sense of community here that is partly born out of I think the closeness of the homes, the way the backyards all look onto each other, the safe spaces for kids to play. All of these things you can really take for granted, and as the new neighborhood is rebuilt, and as we try to upgrade the quality of the housing and make sure that we house people properly. One of the things that was said very early on in the revitalization process, a young guy walked up to me and he said, "Mr. Vaughan, you can fix the neighborhood, but don't break the community." and he was deadly serious about it, right? And one of my big fears when I see the new houses and the new condos and I see the changes happening, one of the biggest fears is how fragile, what's special what this community is, and you just hope and pray that we get it right. And one of the good things about going slow and taking 10, 15 years to realize the full project is that you do have a bit of a space to fix mistakes and to rethink things and to look at streets differently and to reimagine the community center as the neighborhood evolves and changes. And so all of these things that are precious about this neighborhood need to be sustained. And you have to be intentional about it if you're going to do it. And the residents are the folks that have the lived experience and understand it better than anybody. And that's why we've worked so hard to make sure that they're not just at the table, but they're leading the conversation the entire time. And so it's an interesting neighborhood. You can ask people right across this country. And wherever I go, I talk about Alex Park. And I used to say when I was a city councillor, the Alex Park could use a bit more of the city. The city could use a hell of a lot more of Alex Park. And the same is true for Canada. Like I've walked ministers through here. I've walked housing advocates through here. I've walked tenants and residents from other projects and communities and neighborhoods across Canada through here. I talk about it endlessly as an example of what happens when you trust people to dream their own future. And so, it's going to be exciting to see the changes, but you're always nervous that some of the magic of this community is going to disappear when the backyards get a little smaller and the houses don't quite face each other the way they do in this funny little sort of S-shaped neighborhood and stuff. So it's tricky, but you got to trust the residents to make the right call and back the residents when they see a problem.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Ironically enough, your life and career is similar to your father's in a sense. You've had
you've met my sisters, have you? I'll tell you a funny story.
Go ahead.
When I was leaving City Hall, I was going to stop being a politician. I wasn't thinking about running federally, and I used to have clear glasses when I started in politics. And I said, you know what, I'm done with those glasses. Everywhere I'd go, I'd walk in to get, my eyes checked or whatever. People would go, oh, you got the Adam Vaughan glasses. Where did you get those? And I was like, as soon as it became Adam Vaughan glasses, I realized it's time to change my glasses. So I got these glasses, and my older sister said, what did you do? And I said, I got new glasses. I said, you look like Dad from 1962, right? And sure enough, these are the glasses he wore when he was just like landed in Toronto. So it's I follow my dad's career maybe too closely. He did it the other way though. He was an architect who became a politician who became a journalist. I was a community activist who became a journalist who became a politician. And I guess if my next career is architecture, I'll completed the sweep. But my sister and my daughter are architects. That's good enough for the Vaughan family.
It's close enough.
I'll stop now and go on to do something else.
Well, we might have touched on this a little bit, but you've had very well-known public debates with larger-than-life mayors, such as Rob Ford and Mel Lastman.
Was that a debate? I thought that was an argument.
To which we'll touch on that later.
Yeah.
But we were just curious if you would have any idea of what you feel was your father's opinion on former Mayor, former Alexandra Park, Kensington Market residential alumni, Philip Givens, and his push for the 1960 revitalization of Alexandra Park in City Hall. And do you find any similarities with today's revite?
That's interesting. So Phil Givens was when I was a kid, I was a page at the provincial legislature, and Phil Givens was in the House. He was one of those city builders that believed in big projects, renewal, and blockbusting. And he grew up in this neighborhood, as did Mel Lastman. And they both sort of saw it as a slum. And slums were cleared. And you fix slums by bulldozing them and building projects like this. It's a real top-down approach to city building, and it's an approach to city building that sort of saw the future as this big, bold, wonderful thing, and in destroying neighborhoods like this, and they did the same thing in Regent Park. you lost the capacity for self-realization in those projects, because you suddenly went from being a homeowner to a tenant. You know, a lot of hardworking folks in the neighborhood used to own homes here. If they'd still owned those homes to this very day, they wouldn't be tenants in public housing. They'd be literally millionaires, some of them. Right? And the other thing was that you see it in Kensington. You don't see it as much here because it's illegal here. Is when times are tough, you bust open the front door, and you turn it into a market. And part of the revitalization is going to deliver new commercial space here for the community to realize its entrepreneurial dreams and opportunities. And there are lots of folks that run little businesses out of their homes here. And there's this great, there's a woman from, I think it's from the Congo, who does hair.
Yeah.
And you'll see the limousines pull up on a Saturday for a wedding. She does a lot of African weddings, and you watch folks jump out of the stretch limo with garment bags. They walk into her house, they get done up beautifully, they come out like royalty, and they get back in the limo and disappear. That's illegal. All right, and it would have been perfectly legal to have converted Alex Park into a sort of a market environment, much like Kensington Market, if the city had just left it alone. Phil Givens saw Kensington Market as a place to escape, and later as a place to sort of remove from the city. I can't imagine Toronto without Kensington, and Alex Park was produced out of that kind of thinking. And maybe if there was any value in what Givens did, it was that the community he replaced it with sustained the very people that lived there to begin with, and maybe that's that sort of social structure that was there before the buildings were here. Maybe it's part of what's given us the magic of this community to this very day. But I don't think Phil Givens loved this place. I think he saw it as a problem, and creating a project probably did things to this neighborhood that hurt people in a lot of ways, and that some of the challenges in this neighborhood emanate from that vision of it can be fixed, and it can be fixed by somebody from the government knocking on your door and telling you to move. It wasn't a great vision of the city, and he was one of the proponents of the Spadina Expressway, it was my dad had been a liberal at the time and had quit the Liberal Party because they were doing things like that. Hopefully, I think things have changed, but we still would run into it at City Hall, where people had better idea for Alex Park than the residents of Alex Park. Paula Fletcher, an NDP member of City Council, was on TCHC, wanted to triple the size of all the buildings in the revitalization, and then take the money and invest it into other communities. And we had to go to David Miller and say, you can't do that. Right? This is their neighborhood. It's their revitalization. You know, the city wasn't running around here fixing broken windows, and this building was starting to fall apart. The city was nowhere to be found when I became a city councillor. You can't all of a sudden, once they realize a new future, steal it from them. That's just wrong. And so we had to push people away and give AP the space to build itself. And Phil Givens was one of those people that should have been pushed away back in the 60s. There have been other politicians since that have contributed. You know, Dan Leckie did amazing work here in helping to realize the co-op and stuff. But at the end of the day, the politicians that have been the smartest have been the ones that have facilitated the self-realization and not tried to come in here with big ideas, but rather come in here with support when needed. But really keep the big ideas away and let the real ideas become something special. And that's why this neighborhood it tells such a great story to the world, is because it's resisted the temptations and the pressures and the transformations that have been pushed onto it. It's always found a way to push back a little bit and push for itself. And Phil Givens was one of those mayors that did some damage here. But luckily, the community has found a way to protect its voice, proclaim its vision, and seize its own future. And that's a politics which didn't come from a mayor's office. It came from this neighborhood.
Just to maybe expand a little bit, you said some of the, like you mentioned the Dan Leckies award. Who are some of the people that you feel contributed to the growth, I guess, or the preservation?
Yeah. Well, Sonny Atkinson, right? I don't think there was a clearer voice or a stronger vision presented to the community than the one that he presented and then led in terms of the movement towards a co-op. I remember talking to him about it, and he said, this co-op should be hiring the young people in this neighborhood to do the work. We can create our own community here, and we can be in charge of our own destiny if we decide to stand up and take the housing back. He was profoundly important. Donna Harrell, another person here who fundamentally believed in young people and saw the resource that this community has in its young people, which is exceptional. We often say, I don't even know if it's true, but it's certainly one of the reputations is that this neighborhood sends more kids to post-secondary school than any other public housing project in the country. That doesn't come about because you've just got great kids and just got great parents. It's because you've got a great set of neighborhood leaders that are invested in the future of their kids in this community, and they watch out for the kids in this community, and they find a way to bring the resources here. The scholarship program that Tom Clement runs, it's one of the great events of every spring is to watch AP wipe the slate clean with all the scholarships. And you see the families that succeed here. One of the reasons revitalization has to happen is there used to be a family, the house is gone now, but he was a taxi driver. He had 4 daughters, all of them were doctors, off a taxi driver's salary. Right? Those young people are leaders. They're role models for everyone. Look what there's a fifth, a young boy who said, I don't want to go be a doctor, but I don't have a choice. But the 2 are at Harvard, 2 are at McGill. Right? I mean, that doesn't happen just because your parents care about education and raise you with lots of love and support. It also happens because there's a high school, after school help here, and it happens because there's a scholarship program, and it happens because people are invested in making sure that you're part of a bigger thing and part of a bigger project. So the other folks, Olu was here, and I said Donna and Randy before he unfortunately was taken from us, and the Ellises and the Gordons, they'd come back and they'd come back and they would invest what was given to them back into the community, so the next generation had the same sorts of advantages and the same sort of opportunities. It's why one of the beautiful things about the revitalization is putting those family names on the streets, because these streets were created by these families, and the neighborhoods were created by these families, and the kids were created by these families. But more importantly, the future belongs to these families, and it's one of the nicest things. But as I said, when you start putting kids into university and they start getting good jobs, I just met a couple of kids outside, they just got a new job and working in a co-op housing federation. But when kids start to succeed, if you don't have new housing for the community to grow, because communities grow, kids get born, but if you don't have a place to house the successful kids, you almost evict them out of the neighborhood economically. We had protests when we first started the revitalization. Somebody sort of said, yeah, you're gentrifying the neighborhood. It's like, no, I want the strong, capable, the leaders here to live here still. So we're gonna grow the neighborhood, but we're gonna create space for success. But we're also gonna lock in the leadership and pack in the strong role models and the community support systems. And it's one of the tougher parts of revitalization. But those people, as I said, Olu and Donna in the current crowd, with Molson and Kylie and stuff, you can just see the neighborhood regenerating itself. Right? There are kids here that I've known, since they were this tall, who are off doing great things. Little kids that you saw sort of, bouncing around the neighborhood. And every time you see a kid succeed here in Alex Park, it just tells you how sweet the neighborhood is and how successful it is. And it comes from that tradition of strong leadership, and politicians have played a role from time to time. Dan Leckie, sort of pulling the co-op through and making sure that the city didn't get in the way of it, and Joe now and others. It's been getting better and better. And in fact, I think one of the things that I hope I played a significant role in was getting this community to vote more heavily. You talk about the changes. It's easy to point fingers and say they did a lot of good stuff. The people keep doing great stuff, right? And one of the challenges after the first election was to get the vote up. And the reason you got the vote up was so the politicians could never ignore the community ever again. That they had to come here to play, they had to come here to deliver, they had to support the good work being done here. And I think it's allowed Alex Park to be a leader in the city on so many different files. When they tried to sell off, when Rob Ford tried to sell off Toronto Community Housing homes, it was Alex Park that was part of the We Are Not For Sale campaign that turned around that entire thing by showing up at City Hall and protecting other neighborhoods just like Alex Park right across the city. That political strength, there were some folks here at the center and in the co-op movement that helped nurture it. But at the end of the day, it was young people growing up and assuming leadership roles that have really shown the strength of this community. And so, when you talk about Wilson or even Herman Ellis that's down the road at Scatting and Marwa before she moved out with her kids and stuff, these young people that stood up and decided to lead the community for themselves, they're the heroes around here, and they're the ones that have built a better tomorrow for the families that live here now.
Thanks. Very, very, very well said. As a kid growing up, what high school did you attend? And you kind of touched on this as well, but did you have friends that came from the Alexandra Park neighborhood?
Yeah, I went to Oakwood.
Yeah. Okay, Oakwood, all right.
Yeah, so when I grew up, you either went to Oakwood or Central Tech. And so in Oakwood, especially with the basketball program, Randy was a what can you say about Randy Padmore? He was larger than life even back then. He was probably the shortest basketball star on the team, Randy was probably the guy I remember the most. Those are hard time. That was a hard time when he passed. He's missed big time. He was that was the real connection. There were a couple other folks that I getting old now, forgetting, but he was the biggest one. And there's Dexter. He ran track at Oakwood as well. But yeah, there are folks. That was the beginning of Oakwood's sort of rise in basketball supremacy, and AP played a big part of that.
Were you involved in any of the sports yourself?
Do I look like I'm an athlete? I play a bit of hockey and a bit of cricket, but
didn't want to make any assumptions.
I am the smallest Vaughan ever made. All my brothers, all my cousins are 6'4". And bigger. My uncle played for Australia for rugby, and my dad was an Olympic level swimmer and captained a water polo team and stuff. But not me, not me. Unless arguing is a sport, which case I'm pretty good at it.
What reputation and stigma did the Alexandra Park community have at that time, and how's it in comparison to today?
14 Division has always treated this neighborhood hard, and it has not been an easy relationship. And I remember one of the first walking tours I did in Kensington Market on a safety audit, and one of the cops referred to the roaches from south of Dundas, and it was like I stopped the tour. I said, "What did you just say?" Right? And it was this neighborhood has been hurt by bad policing, and that reputation and the way the police talk about this neighborhood in other neighborhoods creates that stigma, and it's not a fair one, and it's not a good one. And even though every neighborhood produces its cast of characters, this neighborhood was kind of punished into poverty, and then it was kind of boxed in by walls, and when hard times started to emerge in some of the houses and some of the families, things got really tough, and that just pushed everything over the edge. And there's been, let's be honest, there's this community hasn't avoided the challenges that the city is going through around racialized poverty, around bad policing, and around drugs and gangs and some of the challenges. But I still contend that yeah, you've got it's there's some tough corners to the community, but more trouble is brought to this neighborhood than comes out of this neighborhood. And if this neighborhood had been left alone, it would have been fine. The projects turned it into a project, and then it got policed like a project, and then it gets referred to as a project, and the reputation exceeds, I think, the real strengths of this community. I think it's an unfair reputation, and the rivalry that's stoked between here and Regent across Yonge Street and stuff. I mean, yeah, it gets real every now and then, and young people take things too far. But the truth of the matter is that every time you put better choices in front of the kids in Alex Park, they make better decisions. And if the city has failed at anything, it's failed in getting those choices put in front of the kids in this neighborhood. And the consequences have been tragic. You know, I think within a couple of weeks of starting as a city councillor, Jonathan was killed after the fireworks dispute. Kids shooting Roman candles at each other. But he was a good, he was a good soul, and he, like you, they're all on that road to making better choices because better choices were being put in front of them, and unfortunately, violence took some of their lives. It's the saddest part about representing this community is the losses. I've been to more funerals in this neighborhood for young people than I've been to for funerals in my own family. I've also been to more weddings in this than for weddings in my own family. It's a hard part of the neighborhood when you count the losses and you think of the folks that were making contributions that were taken from us. But at the same time, there's an obligation. As I said, sometimes Alex Park needs a bit more of the city, and the city can always use a lot more of Alex Park. But it's this community center's never been fully funded. Still hasn't been. But the revitalization was not a city project. We decided we were going to fix the community center, and TCHC could be damned. And as I said, when you put better choices in front of young people in this neighborhood, they make the right choice every single time. And our obligation to the community is to make those choices better and better, more plentiful, more diverse, and the community will fix itself. The community will heal itself because the community knows itself the best. And as I said, this neighborhood knows that its kids are precious, and it protects them with everything they have, even when they go off and make some bad decisions. There's always a space for a better tomorrow held by somebody, on offer to somebody else, and that's the best part about this neighborhood. This neighborhood, when it has a challenge, like even during COVID, it turns its kitchen into a machine and just starts feeding people. You bounce into kids all over this neighborhood, reeling, sort of hot lunches to folks, right? And you see the food bank expand, and you see it just sees the challenge. It addresses the challenge, and it makes things better. And it's times have been tough, yeah. And sometimes it gets a reputation, and sometimes it likes that reputation. Sometimes that reputation is there to keep folks away that could cause trouble. But I think at the end of the day, you spend 5 minutes in this neighborhood, and all you come away with is, wow, that's an incredible neighborhood full of kids. And so, yeah, tough reputation, sure. But if you know this community, it's so much more than that.
Ricky Atkinson is known to have started the Dirty Tricks gang in Alexandra Park.
No comment.
The PO or Project Originals. Sorry, go ahead.
But Ricky, right?
Yeah.
Ricky, he came through some pretty interesting times, and part of the reputation of the neighborhood comes from he was a bandit. let's face it. He was unafraid of anything. But what's he doing? He's back here teaching kids pottery. Right? He's back here talking to young folks, making sure they make better decisions than he made. He's back here honoring his father's name. Right? He comes back here, and as the neighborhood changes and starts to take off in a new direction, he just puts wind in the sails and gets more happening and does better stuff. And not only is he reformed himself, he's here to help other kids avoid some of the challenges that he brought upon himself. He's honest about it, straight up about it, straight in your face about it. larger than life in a lot of ways, but what a life force. And you know, imagine if the choices that young people are having opportunities to pursue today were put in front of him back in the 60s and the 70s. Imagine if he'd been given the opportunity to lead instead of have to chase. Imagine how much further down the road Alex Park would be towards realizing the vision. So yeah, there are some kids that have done some interesting things, and Ricky's certainly amongst them. Feels weird calling him a kid, but when given a chance to show the goodness, he gives us greatness, and he's just another successful kid. Had an interesting road to where he is, but look at what he's doing. Every neighborhood needs a guy like that. And he talks truths to people. Those people are a blessing, and I'm better for knowing him, and the community's better for welcoming him home.
Absolutely. Um, expand on that. The name Project Originals was actually adopted by the low income residents of Alexandra Park community, and it was a name given to them by the public. You having your journalist background and cover the Toronto police in the early era, in your opinion, how did the name PO actually come about and turn out to be a gang?
You know, it's look at. I mean, you know, when we're in high school, we're all twice as tough as we really are, and in an environment where in an environment where a mentor of mine, a guy called Norman Otis Richmond. He used to work at CKLN Radio with me. He ran a program called Diasporic Music. He was one of the founders of the Black Panther Party. Came up to Toronto as a draft dodger. Lives just around the corner at Beaver Hall. One of the things he taught me about the African American and African Canadian experience was that the one natural resource that never has been stolen from the people of Africa is their culture. It's been co-opted. You got the rock and roll, and you got the police doing reggae. Lots of people try to steal it, but the inventiveness of language and the creativity of poetry and the rhythm of not just music but spoken word gives rise to nothing being called by its proper name and everything being reinvented with language continuously. That's part of urban culture in a environment like this, and so. Does a group of friends give themselves a name? Do they start to take on a reputation? Does the neighborhood is anti-black racism sort of project that onto them and so they own it and push it back at the communities? Does that start to get into a whole bunch of other stuff? Do the police stoke it? Do the police target it? Does that targeting by the police lead you to a position where you don't have the same choices other people in the city have? Does that lead into some of the activities that are part of those bad choices we talked about? Yeah, and so does the name emerge? The name emerges. Does it have a reputation? Of course there's a reputation attached to it. Does it start to get glorified as social media starts to take off and give it new meaning a generation later? Yeah, that's part of the challenge of what happens when you don't check bad policing, when you don't confront anti-black racism, when you don't look at the way poverty and racialization impacts families and takes opportunities and choice away from folks. You get people start to make bad decisions because they don't have good opportunities in front to make better decisions. There's a nickname, there's a gang, there's some folks involved. I know, and I've seen it time and time again, that it's sort of a rite of passage to a degree. But when you take a look at young people in their early 20s and as they move towards 30, as they start to have kids and stuff, the best part of Alex Park comes back into their lives because it's in them to begin with. And so, yeah, we can talk about that, but that's not Alex Park. Alex Park is I remember when the Queen Street fire happened and there was a fire here. I got tons of telephone calls from Queen and Bathurst for support. It took me a week to know that there'd been a fire here and their family was up at the hospital at Sunnybrook because the community figured out how to shuttle the family back and forth, how to keep the kids fed, who was going to look after them after school, who was going to get them, everything was taken care of. If you're asking me for what defines Alexandra Park, it's that sense of collective behavior and self-protection and self-realization of community safety. That's Alex Park. It's not the reputation that dances around it. People who haven't been here. It's spend 5 minutes here, you'll see the real Alex Park every day, every minute, and you'll see it with joy. You'll see it with love, and you'll see it as well when someone's lost to the community. You'll see this neighborhood grieve in a way that's also actually kind of healthy. And so I don't look at it that way. I look at good people trying to get better and do better things. And I'm just happy to be able to play a small role in that whenever I can.
Amazing. Um, both you and Ricky have similarities in the sense that both of you, maybe unintentionally, took after.
We have a very similar impression of Julian Fantino. I'll give you that. Very similar.
I'm absolutely sure. Both of you maybe unintentionally took after your father's qualities. What we like to call Papa's cooking. You stayed the course while Ricky had a bigger plate in mind. Ricky's father, Sonny Atkinson, as we spoke about, was a war veteran who fought for the country. He was a leader who engaged and activated his community. He pushed drug dealers out of the neighborhood, and he created the first community housing co-op in Canada. Ricky says that his father was promised that one day the residents would be able to own townhouses and apartments that they were renting. And there might be paperwork of it hidden deep in City Hall to back it up. Do you know if there's any truth to that?
You know, it's part of the revitalization is about home ownership opportunities, right? To cement people's place in geography. Right? Ikoa Benjamin is a professor at Emeritus. She's I think retired now, but she's at Ryerson. Talked about the perpetual state of transaction that African Canadians and African Americans, but Black communities in North America are placed in, where you're always renting something. You're renting the jazz hall. You're renting a microphone. You're renting the camera gear. You're renting your home. You're renting your business. You're never really given full ownership of it. A lot of progressive left-wing folks will say, no, we have to protect the low-income rental housing stock and the rent-geared income units and ... Families do well in this neighborhood, and they shouldn't constantly be paying the landlord. They should be able to let that wealth stay and stop in their families, stay and stop in the community, and build structure and space and permanency in this community. And in a capitalist system, owning capital is a big deal. It's not something which the Black communities of Canada, especially those that come from Nova Scotia, have ever really been given an opportunity to do. And I think that home ownership in this neighborhood is still an important part of revitalization and needs to be spoken to more forcefully. And hopefully programs are emerging to help realize that as new buildings get built. But it's about the Ellis family, the Bird family, the names that are on the streets now. They do own this community. They just don't have title to it. And so that needs to be addressed. You can't constantly ask for communities to live in a state of rent, and because it's going to be temporary. You're going to get pushed away or pushed out, and that is the essence of systemic anti-Black racism. That you're not here. It's not yours. Right. And when you talk to the families and I remember in the circle listening to the stories of the Indigenous and Black communities that came out of Nova Scotia that settled here. Those families in Nova Scotia have never been given title to the land grants that were given to them back in the 1700s. And that perpetual state of always being a ward of the state, a tenant of the state, here temporarily, you're going to be moved. It's how Africville got destroyed in Nova Scotia, but it's also how this neighborhood got destroyed the very first time. Because the early workers here, they did own their homes. That was taken away from the community. And I think there is a very important obligation to return that opportunity, return those choices, and allow families that are succeeding to thrive and to lay down their roots and to make sure that their grandkids have a place that is the family homestead. You don't get that in tenanted buildings that easily. The co-op kind of helps change that a little bit because the co-op belongs to the people that live here. But I think you need to mix the neighborhood, and you need to be able to give people that are, earning a good salary the opportunity to lay down roots and build something for themselves here. That's part of the evolution of Alex Park. But really what it is, it's a return to the way things used to be. And so for those politicians that say, no, it should be 100% publicly owned, public, I have a different take on the history. I've been given different lessons by some of the multi-generational families that are still here.
That's good information. Here comes your good old dad again.
You never asked about my mom. My mom's an important person in all this too.
Actually, let's touch on your mom. Let's touch on some of her background.
So my mom was fought very hard for legal aid clinics in this province. She knew, and I think it's where I am much more like my mom than my dad. My dad was charming. I'm much more. I try to live up to my mother's toughness a little bit more, less forgiving than my dad was. But my mom was strong, but she believed fundamentally that communities that didn't have legal representation were always going to be vulnerable to discrimination and to unequal outcomes. And so the African Canadian Clinic, the South Asian Legal Clinic, she came out of the environmental movement, but she built 89 legal clinics in this province without being a lawyer, working at the Law Society, and created social justice centers that had lawyers working on people's human rights. And that was her life's work. And in doing that, showed me the challenges that were in a place like Toronto and what was possible when people's rights were championed as opposed to fought. Her way of enlisting the community to get behind a project. Mm-hmm. She did a lot of work in the school system as well, championing the rights of immigrant kids to have a fair shot at success, and taught me how to be, I hope, authentic in even though you don't come from the same neighborhood or the same experience, to listen better and to understand strongly, and then to work collectively and to respect the true voices of community, whether it's a geographic or a political or a, ethnic, racial, whatever it is, but to really understand that communities had the capacity to lead themselves if the path was sort of cleared for them a little bit sometimes. And that's where my practice of politics comes from. It's why when the election's on, folks say, "Why you're not going?" I'll come through this neighborhood 3 or 4 times because my obligation is to show that I respect their decision. I respect them, and I have to be present to do that, and I have to listen to do that, and I have to follow through and come between elections. Right? It's one of the. I love coming to the neighborhood just because it's the best neighborhood in the riding. I often say that, but I say it with in other communities at the same time. So I know I'm supposed to love you all equally. I like Alex Park better. You all need to behave like Alex Park more. But I would never be able to forgive myself if I ever took this place for granted. It's an honor to earn votes in this neighborhood, and it's a joy to come in and I put up the signs in this neighborhood, right? It's a handshake. It's a friendship, but it's a commitment that is realized at election time professionally, I guess, for me. But it's built on a sustained presence here, doing ordinary things, because it's an extraordinary neighborhood. And if you do ordinary things in this neighborhood, you doesn't take long to witness the extraordinary outcomes, and it's such a privilege to be welcomed in this neighborhood, and so I get that from my mom. My dad had all kinds of theories and big thoughts and stuff, but it was my mother's focus on relationships and make them real, and be loyal to them, and show up and show up again. And there are young people in this neighborhood. I remember watching some basketball games here and sort of watching like especially with the short nets with the younger kids who think they're all on the way to the NBA, and it's a joy to watch kids play. Right, it's always fun, and I know that you get folks, the older kids would look at you over the shoulder like, "What are you doing here?" Right? Why are you here? What are you watching? Right? And the parents would come by, and it took sometimes 2 and 3 years before you could have a conversation, and then they'd call you Mr. Vaughan suddenly one day, and it's not Mr. Vaughan, it's Adam. And those kids are now leading this community. Like some of those kids, I just bumped into one outside. You're still doing your French, right? You're still on top of that. Yeah, what are you up to? Yeah, okay, cool. And it's, it's watching young kids have kids and become parents and take their place in the community and stuff. It's been one of the most fulfilling parts of public life and my entire time in the city is to watch this neighborhood become what it is. And I get that from my mom and my mom's instructions of you go back and you're there again, and you don't ask them for anything, you ask them what you can do to help. And if you just keep doing that, you'll build trust, and out of that trust, you'll see something special happen. And Alex Park has never let me down on that front.
Absolutely. And I can say that they definitely feel the same about you. And that the genuine nature has translated through, because in speaking to residents of the community and people who've had the chance to interact with you and meet you, they speak very highly of you.
It's kind of you to say, but it's their friendship is one of the most precious things. It's I got remarried recently and brought family. Like my family's all come hang out here, and Nicole said you said you had 2 kids, and I said yeah. I said you got 3. You got another one called Alex. It's like, but she's been here, and I think it opened her eyes to why I do what I do in a way that she hadn't seen before. Because there's no other community where I spend as much time in the riding. It's a special place, and it's a place that when you earn your welcome here, you know it, you feel it, and it's just wonderful to see. Wonderful to see. Like hang out in the kitchen for 10 minutes on a Saturday afternoon. Yeah, you'll have more fun than just about anything else you can do in this world.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you something else. Politics is not always fun, not always easy, and you have to carry a lot of disappointment, and you let people down when you can't deliver. I was talking a few months back here, and I'll say it again. I come back here to be rejuvenated. I come back here. This community inspires me to work 5 times harder than I ever thought I could work. When you see what this neighborhood pulls together, I literally, there are days where I've come here just to hang out, just to get happy again. It's mental health almost, right? It's therapy, because you see folks pulling together, working hard, and making something out of nothing, and making something that was little big, and something that was good great. And it just pulls you along, and it tells you, suck it up, get to work, and it's an inspiration, this place, and it's the joy in this place. Like I've never walked, even the tough day, and I've been here for some tough days, some real tough days. But when the neighborhood decides it's going to be happy, damn it, it pulls you along with it, and that's I in a very perhaps selfish way, I come in here to recharge. It's really it's a very special place, and it has a very special place in my heart.
So you've always seemed to have vision like Colin to architect Toronto with communities in mind.
I don't actually. No, I don't. I see opportunities. I see things that are good and bad and what have you. But the vision for this neighborhood, it comes out of this neighborhood. It doesn't come from me. It doesn't come from anything my dad ever taught me. The ideas for this neighborhood come from this neighborhood. And I know I get some credit for sort of marshaling resources. I was given to-do lists. Like there was no vision for me here. I saw the parking lots as when I was being told that there was no money for the community. I said, okay, where's the value here that could be uncorked, right? I said those parking lots are a waste of time, right? I mean, people need to park the cars. I get that, but that's underutilized. That's an underutilized resource. If we recombine the way the houses sit, yeah, we can turn those parking lots into something. But that came out of a conversation with Sister Zainab and Donna about this building falling apart, the cracks that were in the wall over here. And they said, you got to fix it. And I realized, it was David Miller was the mayor at the time, and I was new on council, and there was no money for Alex Park. It wasn't one of the priority neighborhoods. If it had been picked up and dropped in a different part of the city, it would have been a priority neighborhood like that. But it's surrounded by, a couple of swimming pools, a school, a couple of community centers. It's got transit. It's got access to cheap and affordable food and all these sorts of stuff. Alex Park is bottom on the list. And that wasn't good enough. The residents wanted their community center fixed. So I said, so here's an idea of how you might want to do it. What do you think? And we sat without anybody except the residents for a couple of months thinking about what might happen. And I pulled in architects and planners and a bunch of folks to help sort of pull the vision into a three-dimensional model and think about what the priorities and what the parameters needed to be and the principles, zero displacement being one of the first and most important one, perhaps. We weren't going to repeat what happened in Regent Park and move people away. Don't break the community if you're going to fix the neighborhood. But the vision for this place comes from the people of this place. And to pretend otherwise is to do a real disservice to the folks who demanded a better way forward, and all they wanted was the opportunity to exercise it for themselves. And that's not my vision; that's their vision. I was just happy to help.
Amazing.
If it had been my vision, it would have been a disaster. It would have terrible. I would have broken the neighborhood because I didn't. I've gotten to understand it by watching that vision emerge. And it's even with the new houses and backyards that don't do work and smaller bedrooms and unfinished basements and all that kind of stuff. I remember there was a couple of meetings that were just fascinating. I mean, there's one very famous one where the consultants finally got hired and they were coming in and TCHC had hired a sort of a consulting firm to consult, and the young people in the neighborhood were they hadn't been listened to. They had said, we don't want this, we don't want that, we want this, we want that. They were very precise as to what they wanted, and zero displacement. TCHC refused to put it on the list of the priorities. And so there was a slide showing up, and when the list of the priorities and the guiding principles were up and zero displacement wasn't there, but 8 people got out of this room and it was chaos. And we got them marshaled off into the other side room and said, okay, we're going to fix this. And there were a couple of moments in that meeting that were just priceless. One was Samara they were going through sort of how they were doing consultation. And she said, hands up who's doing social work in the room. And there were about 16 kids in the room, about 5 people with their hands up. We all know the theory that he's playing on us right now. She said, you're not even doing it properly. You're not even doing it. We're social work students, right? We do what you do. You're not treating us with respect. So get out. And Marwa held the room together, to her credit, and was at that point I think she was 15, and said laid down a principle that Joe Cressy later attributed to Jane Jacobs. It was so clever, but when she said, we have the right to say no. And the organizers sort of thought, we have the right to say no, okay? It's our co-op. We have the right to say no. But then she turned to her friends and her cohort, and she said, and she looked at them and she said, but that comes with the responsibility to say yes. It's the most profound theory on planning I think I ever heard in my life. We have the right to say no, but that comes with the responsibility to get to yes. And so they fixed it. They literally took the computer and they typed zero displacement and they changed the slide and put it back up to cheers. And I don't think this, I think from that moment on, the residents have driven this process in a way that no other TCHC community has ever seen happen. And I think TCHC learned how to do things differently as a result of the incredible clarity of the young people who then, a couple of weeks later went out and ran the election and took over the co-op board. A bunch of 20-year-old kids that were running the co-op. And I remember Tom Clement goes, well, that was a bit more successful than I thought it might be. And they let a couple of old people, token old people, stay on the board just so they had some continuity. but that moment of in that meeting, that was a pretty high stakes meeting. And the whole thing was about to fall apart if that room had blown up. They weren't going to translate. They weren't going to go door to door. They weren't going to get the older folks into the neighborhood. They weren't going to stand for it. They were going to take over the co-op and take the co-op out of the revitalization process. And they were just going to do things differently if they weren't going to be listened to. And that meeting changed the course of this community's history. And it came right out of the young people who were invested in getting skills and investing those skills back into the neighborhood. Mara went off and did planning, and then got hired by the planning group that was running this particular project, so she could translate not only what they were saying to the community, but what the community was saying to them. Right? There's not a neighborhood in my field of vision that has had that kind of leadership delivered by its youth. But don't for a minute misunderstand. That leadership was grown, developed, and nurtured in this community by adults that knew that the kids were their best resource and their best opportunity for the future. And as I said, when you put better choices in front of this community, it makes the best choice every single time and makes the best decision. And that's a perfect example of where they provided leadership like no other neighborhood I've ever witnessed in my time in politics. I remember that meeting so clearly. It was a great. It was just the moment that as I said, Joe Cressy quoted it in an article on a different neighborhood and attributed it to Jane Jacobs. It was very funny. I said, Joe, that wasn't Jane Jacobs. Are you sure? I said, no, I remember where it came from. I was there. I still kid Marwa about that. But yeah.
Amazing. March 24th, 2019, you had an interesting tweet that I'm going to read to you, and I'd love for you to elaborate on both points if you could.
Sure. How do I feel like I have to apologize?
One of the many ways to understand multi-generational systematic anti-Black racism in Canada is to add two missing elements to the story. Number one, the Grant family had branches in Toronto in the Alexandra Park community. And number two, the story dates back to the 1700s before the city of Toronto existed.
Yeah, this neighborhood's roots are deep, and there have been a lot of injustices witnessed in this community, and there are a lot of scars of history that are borne by families and family stories and shared intergenerationally in this neighborhood in a way that is different, because a lot of communities don't have that lineage. It's rare to see folks talk about their grandparents on these streets. Right? One of the things I've been allowed to do as a member of Parliament is visit Nova Scotia, and Senator Wanda Bernard's become a good friend and her family. But it's Bartland Old Green, the city councillor from Halifax, who lives in a very similar neighborhood, grew up in a very similar place in Halifax through here. That history is real, and it must be respected, right? And so, yeah, this community's story starts long before Toronto was an idea, and so its presence in Toronto, it matters, and it's not just we all know sort of Black History Month's touch points that, with Albert Jackson and the different families and what have you. What's unique about Alex Park is that history is is both special and ordinary. It's the story of how the Black community in this country survived, and when you got that history living around you, and people talking about it the way they talk about it, when the circle with the Nova Scotian families, those that were talking about the Indigenous roots and their Black roots, and how those two marginalized communities in Nova Scotia and how people marginalized within those communities kind of combined to create their own way of surviving, and they shared those stories and that kind of stuff. There aren't many neighborhoods in the city, because we're a city of immigrants. There aren't a lot of my family can't tell those sorts of stories. I'm the first Toronto-born kid in the family, right? Really, and my sisters and I, my two sisters and I can talk about Australia that way, but even that is kind of a faint, distant place. There are people in this neighborhood who, when they talk about the history of this neighborhood, it comes from a place of origin in so many different ways, and that's kind of one of the unique things about this neighborhood. And the fact that the family names are now being put on the streets is one of the great parts of the revitalization is that we're finding ways to honor those roots in ways that are real, in ways that their grandkids and great grandchildren will be able to come back to this neighborhood and say that's where our family starts. That's where our roots in this country. That's where they take you, and that's a pretty remarkable thing to say about a neighborhood like this.
So we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. One thing that surprised us is that years ago you attended a funeral for one of the young men from this community, Jonathan Musi, also known as J Hood to his friends. We don't normally see counselors of people of your status do that. Did you happen to know him personally, and why did you ultimately decide to attend?
I hadn't met him. I wouldn't say I knew him, knew of him. Look, this I can talk about how to celebrate this community but when hearts break in this neighborhood, they break hard. They break real hard, and if you hear me talk about how much I love the kids in this community, and how proud I am of the families and what they've achieved, when they lose someone, the whole neighborhood loses someone, right? It's never a kid down the block and around the corner. What was his name? That's never part of what's here. It's real, and so it happened. That the shooting and the loss happened. I'd just become counselor, and there was a challenge with getting folks to the funeral because of the way things went down and some of the conflict. And it showed me that part of the neighborhood very quickly, and it's a hard time. You just have to you can't witness that heartbreak and not be with people. So it wasn't a hard decision to make, but it was a hard couple of weeks. I mean, there have been some real hard weeks around here. Some real hard weeks.
And further touching on that a little bit, shooting fireworks at each other.
We got fireworks banned in we went to every single corner store for blocks around with a letter saying that the Roman candles that were being sold were being used to trigger events, and if we could just not do it. And for a couple of years, we almost got banned in Toronto. But that was, we just said, look, there's enough bullets flying around, enough things going bang in the night. We don't need to add to it. So, yeah, it was sad. And he was breaking up a fight. He was bringing sort of, his reputation was a complex one, but he was out there trying to break up fights and keep kids safe. Yeah, he was a good soul. And again, given better choices, he'd have made better decisions, and you could see where he was going to go. In the way people talked about him. He was it was a real loss, real loss.
So to elaborate a bit on that, does it speak to the larger issue of underfunding in the community with those with fireworks and stuff like that being a choice of like entertainment or a
Nah,
way of
look, kids are kids, right?
yeah.
It's what he understood though was someone could get hurt. He wasn't about hurting people. Right?
Yeah.
He was tough, but given the choice, he wouldn't hurt people. And I think what it showed us, and what I think it underscores, is that as strong as the neighborhood is, kids are fragile, and the reason I think the families look out for each other is they know that they've lost a lot of kids in this neighborhood, and so they know they're tough, but they know they're fragile, and they live with that paradox in a way that's the when you attend a funeral in this neighborhood, it's pretty raw. It's pretty raw, and it's. I know we just had another loss just a couple of weeks ago. The only funeral I've been to during COVID, was a guy who saved a young kid's life. We gave him an award, and he broke down in tears. He'd never been thanked in his life for anything. There's some hard stories in this community, but they all come back to a place of goodness, and part of the reason you have to stick with the hard times is because they bring you back to the good times, and it's there've been some hard stories. Hard stories. The story you're not even mentioning Q.
Yes. That was gonna be another question, was if there was any other young people that significantly stood out to your mind.
I remember at the funeral, one of the grade school teachers just breaking down, telling the story of how Q got marched out of the cafeteria when he was in grade 1, and how the school broke him, and how long it took to get him back, right? To get him back into his, because he was a funny, he was a sweetheart, right? He was a funny sweetheart, but the teacher just was shattered, right? As I said, people that are given the opportunity to be welcomed into this community, when a child is lost, it's too simple to say it's family. It's just so real, and it's so sad. And I can still remember that teacher just tears of rage, and knowing that some of the cruelest elements of the city were just rained down upon Q, and he still managed to come back here and step up and contribute and work in the kitchen and work with the younger kids, and he was on the verge of a better tomorrow, and it was taken from him. And that was one of those hard days in this neighborhood. But you got to be there for them, and then you got to come back here, and you got to watch the young kids grow up, because it's the only way to. Sometimes when things are that painful, the only response is to sit here and just listen to the kids laugh for a bit, because they'll pull you forward in this neighborhood. The kids will pull you forward every time. That's, as I said, they're a precious resource here.
Absolutely. The Alexandra Park community has never really had a great relationship with police. And right now we're looking for a community officer that actually cares about the neighborhood. A few years ago, for the first time, we had a couple of officers that actually cared. One in particular, which we referred to as Officer Nick. I'm sure you had a chance to meet him. He grew up in the Flemington Park area and has a background in social work. Folks in the Alexandra Park community slowly took a liking to him because he genuinely cared and he didn't come primarily to police the neighborhood. He actually steered kids away from crime, and he would never force people to give him information, rather would amicably resolve conflicts that could have resulted in people going through the system. Do you feel we could ever get to a point where Toronto police officers are required to have social work backgrounds and come from the neighborhoods that they police?
We don't need cops that are social workers. We need social workers. Right? It's like the police get called to this neighborhood, and the police have done good things and have protected people in this neighborhood and have kept it safe in some ways. You just never know when a cop shows up, what's behind the badge. But the reality here is that if half the money spent on policing this neighborhood had been spent in this community center, you'd have 10 times the outcomes that you're getting right now. So I'm glad that we have officers who are embraced by the community and do good things. It gives you a bit of hope that maybe policing can change. But at the end of the day, it's not about trying to perfect policing. It's about resourcing this community. It's about getting those kids the choices that are better choices, so they make the best choice. And you don't need a cop with a social work degree. You need more kids in this neighborhood with social work degrees. That's the way to build a stronger Alex Park.
Absolutely. Switching gears just a bit, with the position you hold, political tax, mandates, budget commitments, family, personal life, and so on, how do you find a healthy balance and maintain mental health?
Well, I referenced before. I come here. Right? The happiness in this neighborhood, the simple joys in this neighborhood. Whether it's sitting in the backyard and having I shouldn't name names, but having a rum here or there, and or sitting down and having a cold beer in an afternoon, or just sitting watching, kids play. It's there aren't many neighborhoods where I walk through and I get called Adam or Mr. Vaughan. The kids are very polite here. Donna raised them. Miss Harrow gave them all gave them a good upbringing. But no, it's there aren't many neighborhoods where I you just get to walk by and say, "Hi, how you doing?" I've represented most of the neighborhoods in this riding for a better part of 15 years, and I'm on a first name basis with more people in this neighborhood than any other part of any neighborhood I've ever even lived in. So the stress, this is de-stressing. Coming in here and having when they make it doubles because they know you're coming. I mean, geez.
That's that community love.
that's Christmas cake. There's some nice parts of it. I take bribes, and those are two of them. No, it's what other neighborhood in the city does that, man? What other city? It's and I'm proud to like when we brought Martin Luther King the third in through here, right? I was proud to see that was a great afternoon, and I don't think we knew it at the time in the same way we probably do now, but I think that it kind of protected this neighborhood from you look at the Black Lives Matter sort of explosion of political activity and the finally the work that's being done around anti-Black racism. And I don't mean to make this neighborhood out to be a sort of a singular group of people, but his presence here was it was I think this neighborhood putting itself on the world stage in a way. I know the person who helped arrange it, is now the works of the NAACP in Washington. He still talks about this neighborhood. Like coming in as an American into the middle of a Canadian election campaign and talking to a room full of people about civil liberties and civil rights, and just the moment in time that was, it precedes the hyper global political sort of movement that is leading to some pretty interesting changes. But that's part of sort of, Canadians often say sort of we're not like they kind of both distance themselves from America and compare themselves to America, and I think that the link between the old families in this community and the civil rights movement in the States and the generation that sort of came of age when his father was assassinated. I don't think that era of Alex Park is explored as often as it could be, but it was on full display that day. And the pride people had in being acknowledged and being seen, but also in being present with living history was kind of a remarkable day. And it was a chapter of, I wish Sonny Atkinson had been here to see it. I wish they could have met, because they've been doing the same work in a lot of different ways and come out of a very similar time and experience. And I think it's watching the crowd watch him, and then knowing that he still remembers that moment, that time, is it's fascinating. It's a pretty cool community.
That's incredible. That's absolutely incredible.
But without those historic roots, you don't get those moments. And that's what's one of the things that's so special about AP is those roots are deep, and lots of new families here, right? Lots of new cultures, lots of new languages, lots of new experiences, lots of folks who have come from some pretty hard scrabble places around the world. But boy, the families are comfortable together, huh? Yeah. That's remarkable. And it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the leadership in this community brings them together constantly until they see each other as family. It's great.
Well, we've gotten to the last question here. The Alexandra Park Community, the Alexandra Park Community Center partnered with Spadina Community Center, created the Heartworks program, which is a mental health and art-based project. The story of how the funding came about is a beautiful one, and it kind of reflects the nature of the neighborhood as you've been speaking about. A few years ago, our executive director, Mos Katat, wrote a grant to the city to get funding for this project. However, it did not end up getting picked up. So in response, two courageous youth from the community, Obeda and Mugdad, took it upon themselves, utilizing the power of words through poetry, and in Toronto City Hall, full of counselors and such, presented their works. It shook the room so hard that it influenced the approval and created this programming, now servicing the youth of Alexandra Park. In our opinion, these young people possess the same leadership quality you have, your father had in a sense, Sonny had, Ricky had, as well as Donna, Mosen, as previously mentioned, Bob Ellis, and endless others. In closing, can you just speak to the importance of the Indigenous history this borrowed land holds, as well as the significance of the contributions from the members of this community and how it has shaped not only Alexandra Park, but the city on a whole?
So Toronto gets its name from the Mohawk word. It's a noun that references a gathering place, right? A gathering place where sticks are in the water. It's actually referencing the area north of here, but that's where the word comes from. Spadina is a Chippewa word. It's an Ojibwe word. It means higher ground. It's the old lake bed. There are very few places in Toronto where the learnings of the Mi'kmaq people, Tipac, Nova Scotia. The Mi'kmaq people have three teachings that they kind of frame their worldview around. It's wise counsel. You always share your knowledge. You always share what you have, and on life's journey, you always wish them safe travels. And the Nova Scotian roots of this community and the movement towards Toronto and the gathering in Toronto and the practice of sharing what you have, of helping people on their journey and giving them good, wise counsel and all those sorts of things. It's not a learning that you study. It's a practice that's at play here. And I was fascinated in those conversations in the circles when the women primarily were talking about their roots. And I've spent time with elders from the Mi'kmaq community, and I spent time with elders and Indigenous people with learnings they've shared with me. This is one of the few places where you see an old community that has still relies on those early learnings. It's part of what was pulled from Nova Scotia by the railway into this community. It's part of the way in which Black and African Canadians survived in Nova Scotia was adjacency or proximity to the Mi'kmaq people. They were both brutally treated by colonial power, and so they formed bonds and allegiances. And while they're different peoples and different histories, there is a practice that when you suddenly heard the families talking about their aunties and their grandmothers and their relatives back home, you went, this is an old community, even though it's full of a lot of new Canadians. But that sense of linking arms and partnering up and making the community, stronger by working together. That wasn't just Sonny Atkinson. It wasn't just Donna. It wasn't just some of the names we've listed in the conversation today. It's a way of being, and it's probably why when I say come to Alex Park to get rejuvenated, because once you're brought into that circle, they don't let you leave. And it's as I said, when I was a counselor, I said Toronto needs more of Alexandra Park. Canada needs more of Alexandra Park. Alexandra Park has gifts to give, and the harder you work at realizing that, the better everyone is as a result. And so this neighborhood's roots are deep, but its branches, well, sky's the limit. Sky's the limit for this community.
Definitely. Appreciate you, Mr. Vaughan and Adam.
Adam's good. Adam is good.